Hello, everybody. Welcome in to another episode of the Couch GMs podcast. It is Tuesday, December 21st, 2021. I'm your host, George Kerth, here along with Cody Roadcap. Cody, how did you survive week one of the fantasy playoffs, at least so far?
I'm doing good. I'm not ruling anything out quite yet. We're recording this Monday night. We now have 3 games still left, so a lot of things can play out. I lied. 4 games.
3.5.
4 games. 3.5. We are recording in the midway through the Browns-Raiders game, but so 3.5 left to go. A lot of things to still unravel, but it was a tough week for most fantasy players out there.
Yes, it was. Me included in the few leagues that I did make the playoffs. I have a lot that is still riding on some games too, though, so I'm not gonna count anything out either here. We'll talk about some of those brutal fantasy performances and a little bit more. We're going to talk some NFL news. We had some big COVID news other than players going on the injured reserve this week. We're going to talk some players that could help you get through the semifinals of your fantasy playoffs. And we're going to start kicking off week 16 with a Thursday night football preview. Make sure you're still follow us on our social media channels. We're still keeping you up to date as best we can on Twitter. And we're also on Facebook and Instagram. And you can find us on thecouchgms.com as well. With no further ado, Cody, we're not going to start off with NFL news this week. Talk about who was your most brutal week one fantasy playoff performance.
All right, I'll give you I think the most brutal, and I don't want to, I feel like Mike Evans could be like an easy guy to talk to, but he left the game. Same with the Chris Godwin. Like those guys, they were injured. They weren't, that wasn't as controllable as, say, like a Cordarrelle Patterson, a guy who has been the surprise of the NFL season. It took a while for me to get on board. I feel like it took a while for a lot of the fantasy community to get on board. And he go out there and he puts up less than 4 points in half-point PPR. Like that was a brutal loss. It was the week that Tyler Boyd had the big catch and T. Higgins and Jamar Chase were like non-existent. It was just a tough, and we started on Thursday with that high-powered matchup where, Chargers looked good, the Chiefs they didn't look the best, but we started that game and at halftime Patrick Mahomes was at 6 points. And he finishes the game with just under 30 points. And it seems like the rest of the league never got that second half storm. Everyone stayed with how the scoring was going for the first half. No one got the second half. It was a tough matchup, but I do want to, speaking of the Chiefs, Travis Kelce had a huge game.
Yes.
For that one. But I'm going to give you a list of players, and I want you to tell me if you think as a combined they scored more or less than Travis Kelce.
Okay.
So here's the list of players. Tom Brady, Mike Evans, Joe Mixon, Cordarrelle Patterson, Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, Deontay Johnson, Alvin Kamara, Amari Cooper. All those guys combined or Travis Kelce. Who are you taking?
I feel like the only person on that list that I can think of that confidently scored more than 5 is Deontay Johnson. And he wasn't even much more than 5, if I'm thinking correctly. I'm going to say all of those players scored under Travis Kelce.
That is correct. All those players had a combined score of 33.76, while Travis Kelce had 36.1. That's how brutal this first week of the fantasy playoffs was.
Man, and I mean, on top of that, the amount of stars that missed with COVID and injuries as well. Like, there were plenty of people out there that started people who were almost unimaginable, or like grab some guys off the waiver wire like a Devontae Parker or a Jeff Wilson and are gonna win fantasy matchups with it. And it just shows you, number one, how unpredictable the fantasy world is, and two, how much managing your team in season means to winning a fantasy championship. As much as we hype up the draft, and the draft is very important, this is where you win your championships. It's the mid rounds of the draft, and it's using the waiver wire to your advantage.
Absolutely. And and you mentioned like how many back and forth we were with COVID. It wasn't just players missing out. Myles Gaskin, Salvon Ahmed, they were both activated on, I believe it was Thursday. Maybe it might have been Friday, but Thursday or Friday, they were able to get one practice in. They were playing the New York Jets, the worst team against the rush for fantasy running backs. And I was a guy in our league of record. I picked up Duke Johnson, and then Gaskin was activated 2 days before he got a practice in, and so you're like, oh, which one do you? And I ended up going Gaskin, and that was the mistake. Duke Johnson had over 20 points. Miles Gaskin had barely 5. I don't know if that's something that we'll have to monitor long term, rest of season, or if that was more of he had COVID, he's been out for 10 days. We've already had the game plan with Duke Johnson. We're going to roll with it. Or is that now the Miami backfield is now even more of a mess as they add another body in Duke Johnson?
See, a part of me thinks that a lot of that had to do with the fact that they said Duke Johnson's the one that got the practice time. That's why he's the one that got the snaps. But you really don't know. And I mean, that backfield was already enough of a mess that I don't know if I really want to trust them. Um, but yeah, like you don't know. Like there was other running backs that had the same situation. Michael Carter got activated off injury reserve. He was a reliable player for a lot of guys coming up into like before his injury, giving people that good earlier push towards the fantasy playoffs. I know plenty of people that put him in their lineup, and he put up like 2.1 points this week. Like just so much unpredictability in all these different backfields.
Yeah, this seems to be one of the hardest seasons to predict, estimate, guesstimate, if you want to call it, because that's kind of what it is in fantasy football. But just how to proceed with all the injuries, the up and down COVID reports. But I think that's enough talking about the brutal week 1. Like we mentioned, there's still 3.5 games left. You hadn't heard the Chicago Bears. You might already know the results by the time this come out, but they have literally no one left in their secondary. So if you have not Jamar Chase, the other LSU wide receiver,
Justin
Justin
Jefferson.
left, and you're down by a lot, it could be one of his 40-point games. It is possible. I may sound like a complete idiot if he scores less than 10 because this will come out after the game has already happened. But George, let's look ahead to next week and get into some NFL news.
Yes, Cody, why don't we jump into NFL news? And the first thing we have to talk about, this came out soon after our last podcast of last week. The NFL has agreed with the NFL Players Association on a new targeted form of COVID testing. Apparently, part of this rule has something to do with if you are a fully vaccinated player, you are no longer subject to weekly testing. There are still situations where fully vaccinated players may still receive testing. One of them is if they are experiencing symptoms. I believe there is also a situation that could get tested either randomly or if they are a close contact to somebody with COVID. But most of the time, they will not be receiving regular testing. And if somebody that is vaccinated is determined to have COVID, they are now given more opportunities to come off the COVID list faster. The NFL is now starting to employ a strategy that looks at how did they even word that? It was really confusing how they worded it
Yeah,
on here.
for us fantasy football analysts and not medical doctors, but essentially there is something that they can test a part of their testing, and it's a certain value. I believe it's called the CT value. I know George
Yes,
is looking up
it
while
is
I'm
the
talking.
CT value.
And I'll let you go because you know
Okay.
more about it than I do.
Okay. So the CT value is basically says how much a player is likely to spread the virus. If the CT value is more than 35, they are considered to not be able to spread the virus anymore, even if they could still test positive on a test. So now there's 3 ways that they can return from the COVID list. They either have 2 PCR tests, which are those overnight tests, that are either negative or produce the CT value higher than 35, 1 PCR test that is negative or has that value, and a negative rapid test that are taken within 24 hours of each other, or 2 negative rapid tests. So before they had the whole 24 hours apart, that's no longer a thing. Now you can do 2 tests in the same day, and it's basically just 1 test confirming the other, and they're going to go with it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of new information. You can find all the information on Twitter or the NFL's website. They released the memo. They sent all to teams, and we're going to see quickly on how these new protocols taking effect. We have guys like Jared Goff, who was added to the list on Monday. Travis Kelce was added to the list on Monday, and a handful of other guys that were added to the list on Monday. And now it's not a long shot to play. They're hopeful that they'll get them back. And I mean, Travis Kelce is a big name. That's going to be a guy that people are relying for in the fantasy playoffs because if you had him this week, you're moving on. So That's a guy that you're going to need for the semifinals. And again, I know we're talking about COVID. It's still something, hopefully stays asymptomatic, and we hope him a quick and fast recovery if symptoms do become mild or hopefully do not come severe. But their health and safety is first, but we still want to root for these guys to get better healthy and get better back, because obviously we need them to help us win our fantasy championships.
Definitely. And I feel like we'd have a different tone if a lot of these guys were symptomatic, but like out of those 120 something, I think it was 120 something players that tested positive last week, over 80% of them
We're
were
over
asymptomatic.
200.
We're over
We're over
200
200
now in the last 2 weeks, right?
since the last 2 weeks, and 2/3 of that group are currently asymptomatic, and the other third is pretty much mild symptoms. So luckily so far everyone is either recovering well, mild symptoms, doing, or asymptomatic, and hopefully it stays that way as we still try to navigate this pandemic. So we talked about guys that could be out with COVID, but we also have to talk about guys that are done for the season. And if you watch the Sunday night matchup, the Buccaneers were dropping like flies. The big name, though, is wide receiver Chris Godwin. Was confirmed to tear his ACL, and he is out of the season, or out for the rest of the season. That is a huge loss for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Not only did that, they also did lose Mike Evans, who is week to week, and Leonard Fournette, who is week to week. So some guys that hopefully will be back for the playoffs, but they did get banged up. But Chris Godwin, he was playing on the franchise tag. So not only does this hurt him, hurt the team, it hurts him going into next year, because at this point, he's most likely starting the next year on the PUP. He's not playing for the first half of the season. Will he have to take another 1-year prove-it deal to try to cash in after he fully recovers? Definitely a tough blow there. But George, are you worried about the Bucs with all these injuries, and especially a guy like Chris Godwin?
Starting off with Godwin, I would not be shocked to see him come back to the Bucs next year, play 3/4 of the season on the Bucs again, and try to make another Super Bowl run on that 1-year prove-it deal. That would probably make the most sense for him, and the Bucs would be able to get a discount. As much as we would love that. When it comes to the Bucs as a whole, the only thing that would worry me is, one, if Mike Evans misses time, and two, if they do not get Antonio Brown back soon. It sounds like Evans has a shot to play this week. Antonio Brown, I believe, also has a shot to play this week. When it comes to the running back room, if they're missing Fournette, I think Ronald Jones will be a solid fill-in for your fantasy team. He'll be a solid fill-in for the Bucs themselves. They're a pretty deep team. I understand that, like a lot of injuries can catch up with them, but this team is pretty deep at almost every position. They've still got the pass catcher and Gronk there as well. The only thing that seemed to be struggling for them was their second tier wide receivers were the only position group that I saw that was not deep, but they could get two of those top three back right away, and I don't see it as a problem.
Yeah, and I think it's also worth noting, I saw a lot of comparisons, when the Packers went into Arizona and played without Lazar and Devontae Adams, and how they were still able to perform, and then Tom Brady couldn't do anything with the backup guys. I think it is worth noting that they all got hurt during the game, so there was no practice time or prep.
Mm-hmm.
I still think Tyler Johnson is a really good young wide receiver. Scotty Miller, he's been there in the past. Brashad Perryman, if he can get healthy, I think can add some value to that. So they still have some talent. So like you hinted at, they're still a deep team. Obviously, they're not going to be able to replace Chris Godwin easily. Mike Evans is another key name. If he misses a week or two, that could be a tough one for them to overcome. But once it comes to playoffs time, I think the Bucs will be right back in it. Moving on to the next guy that is hitting the IR is a team that is going nowhere this season. But I think it's worth noting that's Daniel Jones. He has been dealing with a little bit of a neck injury, and they are essentially shutting him down for the season with his necks. Necks are always scary because you never know how long it's going to take to fully recover. But my question is this the last we've seen Daniel Jones in a Giants uniform or the Giants quarterback?
Ooh, I was not expecting that question coming at me today. I
Good.
think
Like the unexpected.
I think if it was any team other than the Giants, I would say yes, that's the end of Daniel Jones. The Giants, I feel like, could try to give him another season. Like, I feel like they've had this really strange, unjustified trust in him. I say unjustified because I feel like I've not seen anything out of Daniel Jones in the first 2-3 years of his career that has given me any reason to want to keep him as a starting quarterback. And they're going to probably feel like he hasn't had a fair shot with all these weapons because either he was hurt or they were all hurt. I mean, I get it. He might not have had a great team around him, but even quarterbacks that are semi-special, I feel like have performed better than Daniel Jones has with the limited weapons he's had. I think he should be gone. The Giants, I would say there's I'm going to give it a 60% shot that he stays there next season.
All right, that's a little bit higher than I expected, but I think you made some valid points. I will throw in there, thinking about the potential draft prospects. If you're in the need for a quarterback, it's not the year to do it. There are a lot of Daniel Jones-esque prospects. They have some good attributes. They need polish. They need well-rounding. I'm not saying that they're all. Some are going to be better than Daniel Jones. Some are not going to be. That's just how it's gonna go. But there's no clear-cut, top quarterback talent or top quarterback prospect in this year's draft. So that could be another factor in why Daniel Jones is back. Our last little bit of news. There's two parts we want to get to. They go hand in hand. First off, the Green Bay Packers are the first team to clinch a playoff spot after winning the NFC North. They run the North, Kings of the North, all you Game of Thrones fans out there. But, we're talking about the first team to make the playoffs. We're also going to talk about the first team at the top of the draft, and it is no longer the Detroit Lions. The Jacksonville Jaguars have taken over the top spot in the NFL draft, looking to do what the Cleveland Browns did a few years ago by taking the top spot in back-to-back drafts. We'll see if they're able to hang on. Just a franchise that is in a complete mess, but hopefully, another draft pick, maybe they can turn it around, find the right head coach. Jacksonville has a lot of opportunity ahead if they can get under the right guidance and direction.
And I'm very interested to see if Jacksonville stays there, if they're going to trade out of that top spot, if a team's going to be interested to try to come up and get their favorite quarterback of choice from this week quarterback class, or if this is going to be a draft where you see a Jadeveon Clowney or a Myles Garrett kind of player go at that first spot, because there's plenty of those in this draft. This is a defense-heavy draft. And see if Jacksonville wants to bolster up that side of the ball by getting them a captain on that side, and see if Trevor Lawrence will come together on the other side.
That is definitely going to be something fun to watch if they keep that. Will they keep the first pick for a guy like Kayvon Thibodeau or Adam Hutchinson, the Heisman finalist? Or, because there's really not it's not a great class unless they're going to go for an offensive lineman, but I still think they would trade back for if they can to take an offensive lineman. So hopefully a team is up and needy for the quarterback. But that's enough news and notes. It is time to get into George's favorite segment, Quotes of the Week.
Quotes of the week. I'll head it off here. Traveling back to Detroit. Dan Campbell made me want to run through a brick wall after he had his inspiring post-game speech after the Lions upset the Arizona Cardinals, kicking it off with, "Welcome to Detroit." He had a lot of other things to say. He was talking about how it was such a big team win and how they could be missing everybody and these guys can still come together and put together a performance like that against a football team like the Arizona Cardinals. Very inspiring. Also, another shout out to our former classmate at Kutztown, Kutztown alumni Craig Reynolds, for having a 100-yard rushing game. The Detroit Lions are 2-1 over the last 3 games, Cody. That's why Jacksonville has the top spot in the draft now.
I know Detroit. It's getting crazy. I mean, that's why Dan Campbell's yelling "Welcome to Detroit." You mentioned that was an inspiring speech. Definitely should check that out. It's over on Twitter. Again, shout out to Craig, and not only for hitting that 100-yard mark, but getting called up to the active roster. This game, though, I know it's Hot Take Monday. I know what it is. Tyler's not here. He'd probably give you the same hot take. But I've seen a little bit of buzz that because of how outcoached and outplayed the Arizona Cardinals were, that it is now this game could have now put Cliff Kingsbury on the spot. I know they lost DeAndre Hopkins, but they didn't look the best against the Rams last week. If this team sputters down the stretch, barely squeaks into the playoffs or makes the playoffs and gets an early round exit, do you think there's any true chance that Cliff Kingsbury isn't back? I mean, 2 weeks ago he was like the front runner for Coach of the Year, and now there's some hot takes that he might not be back. I don't see how that's possible, but I wanted to get your opinion. Do you think there's any chance of like an utter destruction where he isn't back next year?
I mean, you're talking it's hot takes Monday. I think it's overreaction Monday in that case cuz like you said, they're 2 weeks removed from him being a coach of the year candidate. They're 2-3 weeks removed from getting big wins with a backup quarterback. Like, sure, they got out coached this week. Detroit, sometimes those teams that are out of the playoff chase and are just playing with pride, bring in some of these practice squad guys that are just playing for their NFL lives, can come out there and shock people. One, you don't see much film on those players. Two, they're going to play desperate. They're going to do everything off the cuff to try to catch you off guard and beat you in a game. Those teams are sometimes the most dangerous. I don't see any reason why Cliff Kingsbury's seat should be warm at the record he's at, how well the Cardinals have done so far. I get it, it's going to be tough for Cardinals fans if they do sputter down the stretch, but like you said also, they're missing their top weapon on offense besides maybe Kyler Murray's legs and DeAndre Hopkins. And as much as your team should be able to work without that, that's a loss that's big enough that does mean your offense should take a step back. If you don't take a step back when you're losing a DeAndre Hopkins on any offense in the NFL, I would be impressed. So there's justification behind what is happening in Arizona, but they still should play better than they did against Detroit this week.
Absolutely. I definitely agree that they should have played better. And I agree. I think maybe I said hot takes. I think overreaction is definitely the better word for it. So I appreciate you for picking me up on that one. And I think what we just witnessed is like the epitome of a trap game. They had the division rival against the Los Angeles Rams last week. They have Detroit here, and then they have the hot on a roll Indianapolis Colts next week. I think they got a little too carried away looking ahead, thinking Detroit was an easy win. And, a lot of players will say, any given Sunday, this league will humble yourself quick. And the Arizona Cardinals experience that. And, they even have the Cowboys after the Colts. So they have like 3 out of 4, like really important matchups. So I think they just fell into a little bit of trap game. And I think they'll bounce back. I think they'll be fine. I think the Cliff Kingsbury on the hot seat is like one person even tweeted someone in Arizona, one of the Arizona, I don't know if it was radio host, I believe, was like Super Bowl or fired. I was like, bro, you need to calm down. Like it was one bad loss. Like they suck. It's awful right now because that loss pretty much, it doesn't completely remove them, but it makes it very hard for them to get back into the number 1 seed and get the home field advantage to Arizona. So it's a brutal loss, but rekindle the fire, get back on track against the Colts and the Cowboys, finish off with the division matchup, get ready for the playoffs. They'll be fine. They're going to be competitive. Our next quote, though, is George is probably going to hate this one, is from Eagles rival, Dallas Cowboys cornerback, potential defensive player of the year. He was quoted after the game saying, "We're the best defense for sure."
That's Trayvon Diggs because he didn't say the name. He's wanted to make me
Trayvon
say
Diggs.
it, I think.
Absolutely. Wanted George to get out the Trayvon Diggs. We're the best defense for sure. I think they are the best fantasy defense.
Oh, they are the best. I think they are the best fantasy defense. These guys are just turnover machines.
Absolutely. I mean, granted, if Tyler was here, he would be like, "Oh, they get to play the NFC East." That wasn't my Tyler voice, but I don't know what that came out to be. Well, he doesn't sound anything like that. No disrespect. I love Tyler. He's just not here.
The funniest thing actually about it, you can look at this from 2 different sides, from 2 different NFC teams, because there's the Cowboys defense, who is this ultra aggressive defense. It's going to turn you over a ton, but they're also going to give up points and touchdowns because they're going to play so aggressive that they're going to blow some coverages or they're going to miss this one play and it's going to be broken open in the secondary. The Eagles defense is also a top 10 fantasy defense that plays ultra conservative. They're still going to get you defensive points because they are going to get the occasional turnover. They're going to get a lot of sacks because they don't blitz a lot, but get a lot of sacks with their strong front 4. And they give up less points because they're playing conservative. They bend, don't break. So, are they the best defense? For the NFL standard, no, because they still give up a lot of points, even though they do a good job of turning the ball over. They're going to make a lot plays more than they're not, just because they are talented, but they're not the best defense in NFL stands. Are they the best defense in fantasy? Yes, because what do you care about in fantasy football? Defensive touchdowns, fumble and interception recoveries, and sacks. And what did they do? All of that, a lot.
All right, so I think we're both interpreting that as he was talking fantasy when I believe he wasn't. But here at the Couch GMs, that's how we're going to interpret it. Our last quote, I think there might be some bones to pick with this one after I gave you those stats on Travis Kelce, but Ravens cornerback Marlon Humphrey, who is out for the season, was at home watching the game, so he was able to live tweet during the game. And after Mark Andrews scored his second touchdown, he tweeted out, "Stop playing with the best tight end in the league." Now, George Kittle has slowed down a little bit after he exploded a few weeks in a row. Travis Kelce literally just became like the first tight end ever to have 5 straight 1,000 yards seasons. I mean, Mark Andrews did get over 1,000 yards this year. I believe it's very close
I got
on who's
stats
leading
for
it.
if you just want to toss it.
Oh, perfect. He's got
Okay.
stats. Thank gosh.
Okay. I noticed this coming into the week, and I was shocked that Travis Kelce was actually no longer the number one tight end in fantasy entering the fantasy playoffs here this past week. I checked it now. He is still not the number one tight end in fantasy football this year. It's actually Mark Andrews. And their stats are actually extremely similar. Mark Andrews has 2 more catches than Travis Kelce. He has 4 less yards. They have the same amount of total touchdowns. The only difference in scoring is that Mark Andrews has scored 2 2-point conversions and Travis Kelce has 1 fumble. So it is a total difference of 4.2 fantasy points. That's it.
It could have been more if he would have caught that last one if Darnell Savage didn't tip it. But if anyone doesn't know, I'm going to go off a little tangent here.
Uh-huh.
Me and my fiance made a last minute decision. And when I say last minute, I live an hour and 50 minutes from M&T Bank Stadium. We bought our tickets at 12:42 was by the time we like threw on Packers jerseys and drove there, got to our seats 10 minutes before kickoff, very last minute to watch that game come down to a 2-point conversion. Man, it was 1, super exciting, and 2, Mark Andrews was eating us alive. If you watch that game, the Ravens literally put 2 people on Devontae Adams like 80 to 90% of the plays. Literally had the cornerback and then literally just had the one safety stand right behind the cornerback. And they're like, if he goes left, you got him. If he goes right, I got him. Like, that's how they played it. And we're sitting there going, why aren't they doing that with Mark Andrews? I don't know if he doesn't have the full respect yet. He should. He's a very good tight end. I mean, you can't do that with the Chiefs because, okay, well, they have Tyreek Hill. You have to at least spread out but who on the Ravens outside of Mark Andrews are you worried about? Yep. Hollywood Brown can hit you with a big play. Rashad Bateman hasn't lived up to his expectations for his first round pick. He was injured. He's a rookie. Most rookies are bad. I'm not just throwing him out saying he's a bad player. But the fact that Mark Andrews is the number 1 guy in the Baltimore offense, and he is still getting the yard. It blows my mind. It blows my mind when Devontae Adams gets his points. It blows my mind when Stephon Diggs gets his points. It blows my mind when Tyreek Hill and Travis Kelce are both putting up huge numbers. Like, it's like, how are you not like making sure someone else beats you? But props to him. I don't know if he's the best tight end overall. Again, if we're going to interpret this in fantasy, well, technically he is the number 1 fantasy tight end. But overall, I think I would still put him at 3. I would take Kelce, Kittle, and then him. But don't get me wrong. This is no longer like Travis Kelce and George Kittle are in a spot of their own. They're all 3 deservedly in that conversation.
Definitely. And that's changed a lot because of Baltimore using the passing game more in their everyday game plan this year. They talked about it preseason. They have stuck to it. It has changed a lot in that Baltimore team. But I think that'll wrap up quotes of the week here. We had some good little extra debates in there. I like the topics we had going on this week. But the fantasy season's not over. We have to talk a little bit of week 16 waiver wire. And be sure to check it out on thecouchgms.com. Coming soon, there is the waiver wire article posted by myself. I'll give you guys a little bit of extra help on who to add. You got to check with your platform this week because some waivers are getting pushed back a day to Thursday this week. Some are still going on Wednesday. I know Yahoo is one of the platforms that is pushing back to Thursday because of the Tuesday football games. But yeah, make sure you're checking out your specific platform to see when your waivers are going to clear this week. But I'll just start us off here. We know that Joe Mixon was one of those guys that busted this week. He got 6.5 half PPR fantasy points, and he ends up leaving the game with an injury. We're unsure of his stats for this week. So somebody who, if you don't already have him as a Mixon owner, or if you're desperate for a running back otherwise, Samaje Perine could be the lead back for the Bengals this coming week. He has shown explosions in the past. He is maybe not the most reliable option, but definitely somebody that could come help you in a pinch if Mixon is out next week.
No, I agree. I like the Samaje Perine ad, and great point pointing out that the waivers might be off a day, so make sure you either have them in normal time. Don't forget about them. If you're a guy that's or guy or person, female, whatever, that forget your waivers often, well, make sure you're checking the day that they normally run. You might get lucky with an extra day. Samaje Perine is definitely a great pick. A guy you should definitely check if he's available. He was available in one of my leagues, but that league does not have IR spots. That is Antonio Brown. If for some reason somebody dropped him, like I mentioned, my league doesn't have IR spots. Someone needed players to get into the playoffs, so they had to cut a few good players like Antonio Brown, whose value is now even higher with the absence of Chris Godwin. You expect him to see a lot of those snaps. Mike Evans, if he can't go, they're expecting him back this week. We're not 100% sure on where he is health-wise because he was still dealing with an injury despite his 3-game suspension. But there's no concern about him not coming back to the team. They all were welcome back. Bruce Arians said they served their time. They essentially they served their time, but our best chance is with these players, so we're going to keep them around. So he will still be there. But since he was a check if available guy, I'm going to give you another name that he probably shouldn't be available because I've been talking about this guy for weeks, and it was a very slow burn to get to where he's at now, and that is Jeff Wilson Jr. He finally came alive this past week. I know it was against the Atlanta Falcons. It is a pretty easy run defense and a pretty good matchup for fantasy running backs. But Elijah Mitchell is still dealing with some health issues. His knee swelled up again. That's why he was unable to go. We're unsure of his status for next week, but we did see Jeff Wilson get the 18 carries. We saw him get into the end zone. He had a solid fantasy performance. The 49ers have one of the best playoff schedules of all fantasy running backs. So Jeff Wilson can be in your starting lineup. I mean, it's going to be interesting to see how they handle Elijah Mitchell if he would come back, but we're going to proceed as if Elijah Mitchell will be out again until that knee is completely covered up, and Jeff Wilson should be a guy that you're targeting.
Definitely agree with that. It's just I only get worried if Eli Mitchell ends up coming back. How even if Eli Mitchell's use is going to be muddied at this point, part of me just hopes that he stays out for the rest of the fantasy regular season and we can keep rolling with Jeff Wilson because I hate the 49ers backfield. I'm going to go back to the Buccaneers because they also lost Leonard Fournette. As you heard earlier in the show, he is week to week. If he is out, another running back handcuff to grab, if you did not already, is Ronald Jones. I know he's definitely somebody we talked about in the if you have Fournette, add Jones. So if you didn't, now you wish you did, and that's why you should have listened to us in the past here. Ronald Jones has been an effective fantasy running back even last season when he was given starting running back carries. I had no doubts in him being a starter on your team if he is the number one. Please go out there and get him if you're a Fournette owner and handcuff yourself in case Fournette doesn't go.
Yeah, we told you a week ago that you should go out and get Leonard Fournette. I told the story how I was 6 minutes late for a guy that I will most likely be playing next week who now has Ronald Jones. So playoff Ronnie time is among us. Hopefully Leonard Fournette can get back quickly. I'm going to go to another running back, and I guess my guys are just this stingy running back by committees that we're finally starting to see a guy take over. So do not be mad at me next week when we're back to 100% committees, but Devin Singletary seems to be the guy that has won the job in Buffalo. He was on the field over 92% of the snaps on Sunday. He looked good. They started running the ball more. The Buffalo Bills team is starting to look like they are finding their rhythm again. This team is starting to get hot again. It could be a team that we're watching late into December. January, possibly even February. The fantasy playoff season doesn't go all the way into that, but Devin Singletary is, as of now, the guy in Buffalo, and should at least be worth adding if he is available.
And if Zach Moss is randomly active next week, beware, because I feel like every time they make him active and not a healthy scratch, he gets at least 10 carries. I still don't understand Buffalo, but you're right. Devin Singletary is the guy right now. He actually is scoring fantasy points. He's somebody worth owning. One more handcuff I got for you. Justin Jackson, because Austin Eckler was recently placed on the COVID list. So we always talk about how this is probably a sketchy backfield once you lose Eckler because you really don't know where they're going to go. It always seems like the first person who's going to get a crack in LA if there's no Eckler is Justin Jackson. So he's the first person I would run to. There may be some people that say Joshua Kelly. There may be some people that say Larry Roundtree. But if you want the person who's going to get the most carries, even though he's not the flashiest name, the biggest playmaker, it's Justin Jackson. I think he's your safest bet to go out there and grab.
I love that addition that you're recommending. Just watching the game on Thursday, Justin Jackson, I mean, Eckler was already dealing with an injury heading into that game. Now, he would have the 10 days rest if he's able to go and get off the COVID list. But Justin Jackson, by far, looked like the best running back on the field against the Chiefs. I know the Chiefs are missing Chris Jones, a big guy against the run that they have in the middle that wasn't there. But he was explosive. He looked more explosive than I had ever seen him. So I think Justin Jackson is a guy that you might want to consider picking up, even if you hear Eckler is going to get activated, just as a potential handcuff as you move through. Because again, there's 2 weeks left in the fantasy football playoffs if you're in the league that does it right. If your playoffs are just starting this week, I'm sorry. Hopefully there's not too many teams on bye or resting starters in weeks 18. It doesn't look like that way according to where the standings are, but we'll see how things shake out the next few weeks. But go out there and get rid of guys that you're not like. I talked about last week. Chase Claypool, the dude, he can be cut. I know it's hard. He was a top 6 round pick. He hasn't really performed. He's had some big weeks. He's a big play guy, but he can be cut. He's not an every week starter. You can find a big play guy on the waivers if you absolutely need to. So go out there, get rid of those type of guys that you're not going to. Brandon Ayuk, he can be cut. He looked like he was coming back on, but he can be cut. Go out there and get your handcuffs and get good. Don't hold on to guys too long. This is now, we talked about at the top of the show. This is where you win your fantasy playoffs. You have to be playing the waiver wire. You have to be able to let go of guys that aren't going to help your team. If you're not going to start them over the next 2 weeks, they don't need to be on your team unless for some reason you are loaded at one position and say you have Saquon Barkley and 4 other good running backs because you don't need to cut Barkley because he will come back to bite you in the fantasy playoffs. If he's a star, you keep him. If he's not a star, it's time for them to go. Now that I just went on my little mini rant, I'm going to talk about another waiver wire guy. And Marquez Valdes-Scantling is emerging as the solid number 2 in Green Bay. I know it is a very tough situation because Davante Adams is the number 1 guy. He sees a lot of targets. They get the tight ends, the running backs involved. So there's not normally a true number 2 in the system that can consistently put up fantasy points. But as of now, Marquez Valdes-Scantling looks to be the guy you traditionally think is Marquez Valdes-Scantling as the deep play threat. It takes one play, but he has done it now as a guy that's been reliable. He's been on third downs getting some targets. This past week, he had 5 receptions for almost 100 yards and a touchdown. A great week for fantasy. He's a guy that, he's in a better offense. Again, Chase Claypool for Marquez Valdes-Scantling seems like a questionable move at this point, but Valdes-Scantling has the higher upside. They're both the one big play and can make the difference, but now Scantling has the better quarterback and is getting involved in like the middle of the range. They're not all deep shots. He's getting crossing routes. He's a guy that could be a sneaky addition, a solid flex option for you moving forward.
Man, I'm one of the people who is the most critical on anybody but Davante Adams at wide receiver in Green Bay. But I exactly see where you're coming from. I have seen a lot more effectiveness, a lot more usage in the offense out of those secondary receivers now in Green Bay that I have not seen in years past. I have not seen earlier in the season. I think part of it has to do with the Randall Cobb injury, And the fact that you said MVS is getting third down targets now, MVS is getting more targets between the 20. I think it's literally because they lost that short field, dump down, all reliable player, and somebody has to take it over. And now it's going to him and Alan Lazard, a little bit more to him than Lazard. So I agree with you. He's now rosterable. He is potentially flexible if you are in a situation where you're desperate. Go out and grab him. You're right. I'm starting to come around, and I'm one of the people who has been very, very critical of those receivers on Green Bay. You know it.
No, you absolutely have been, and I considered putting Alan Lazard on this list as well because he has been, a guy that's getting catches, getting targets, a guy they've been using, but he also doesn't have the big play threat that MVS does. So MVS is becoming the guy that's getting, a 5-yard outright that a 5-yard out route that has the potential to go 75 for a touchdown, or he's getting the 40-yard bomb. Alan Lazard's more of your possession guy, your third down, you're solid. He doesn't they throw him a deep shot every once in a while, but that's more of like a, hey, don't forget about Alan Lazard. But MVS is the guy they like to get big plays to, and he's becoming more of a pass catcher. So I definitely like MVS this week. I also love the guy that George is about to talk to, brother of Packers wide receiver Equinemius St. Brown, Amon-Ra St. Brown.
Amon-Ra St. Brown is really becoming a reliable weapon for Jared Goff in Detroit. And I know I've been trying to get you guys to add St. Brown for the last couple of weeks, but even more now because they now have a matchup against the poor Atlanta Falcons defense this week. He is definitely somebody who is in flex consideration this week now, showing how he has been more used. They are still missing some of those top weapons now for the season, even like Hawkinson's gone. Somebody's going to have to take those targets. They still could be missing Swift. They still could be missing Jamal Williams. You never know. St. Brown has become the guy in that passing offense, even more than Josh Reynolds, who you might think would be the number one target because he is the notable name. It's not him. So if you need a wide receiver, I think he's probably my favorite on the free agent market for you to go grab that you might have to start this week. MVS would probably be my number 2. But yeah, Amon-Ra St. Brown is my guy. If you are desperate at wide receiver, go get him.
I do like Amon-Ra St. Brown. Over the last 3 weeks, without Hawkinson, without Swift, he has seen 12 targets twice and 11 targets. So he is definitely getting some volume. If Swift is able to come back, some of those targets might decrease, but Hawkinson doesn't appear to be coming back this season. So I think Amon-Ra St. Brown, if you need a wide receiver this week, he should be your top waiver priority, the guy you're spending the most fab on for sure.
Dump the rest of your fab on him. There's a good chance you're not going to need another, especially if you're listening to us and going out and getting your running back handcuffs. You can waste the rest of your fab on a St. Brown and just make sure you get him to get you down the rest of the stretch.
Yeah, I would encourage you to leave $5 if you have fab just for next week, or maybe you want to pick up a defense, just so you have I don't ever like to let my budget go to zero. Okay. So if I can keep $5, I will, just in case, if everybody has, and there's a big injury, you at least have something to at least go out and attempt to. But yeah, at this point, you can dump more fab than you would traditionally do it. I think Amon-Ra St. Brown is a wonderful addition, probably the top wide receiver. Another wide receiver you should be considering is the wide receiver of the Buffalo Bills. That is Gabriel Davis. Emmanuel Sanders, at the beginning of the season, we were telling you that he was a viable option as a fantasy player. He has been hurt the last several weeks. It doesn't look like he is going to be back this week either. And Gabriel Davis has stepped in really nicely. He is a guy that, again, very similar to a Marquez Valdes-Scantling. Stephon Diggs is the number 1 target. Dawson Knox is the number 2 target this season. But Gabriel Davis seems to get third down. Josh Allen trusts him, and he has big playability. So those are the type of guys, if you're in a tough situation, you need somebody, and, there isn't a star on free agency, which there shouldn't be at this point, where, in most leagues, the semifinals of the playoffs, a guy like Gabriel Davis is on a high-powered offense that is catching their rhythm. They're starting to put up points again. The quarterback likes him. He's used in more ways than just one. So Gabriel Davis is a sneaky addition that could be a solid flex option for you this coming week.
Definitely. And for any of you who might not know much about Gabriel Davis or have not been paying attention to him because you've been looking at the Emmanuel Sanders and the Cole Beasleys, Gabriel Davis is just a touchdown machine. Like, he is what was earlier this season Hunter Henry or James Conner. Like, he's not even really as touchdown dependent as some of those guys, because in this situation when there was no Sanders, he's getting enough targets to be a fantasy relevant receiver most weeks without a touchdown. But even yet, he scores a touchdown pretty much every single week. He's kind of been a touchdown machine even last season, the little bit he was used. So I like his upside just because even though his floor might be lower than your average flex play, like maybe his floor is a 6 or a 7 point week, his ceiling is still a 20-25 point week because of his ability to pull in 2 touchdowns in a game at will.
Absolutely. I agree. He's had at least a touchdown in each of the last 3 games. So it's always tough to chase touchdowns. They eventually regress to the mean, but it's the Buffalo Bills. It's not a team that doesn't put up points. The Buffalo Bills, they had their rough spot. I'll keep saying this. They look like they're getting back on track. And I know, again, it's not a great matchup. They go back to New England. They have another divisional, so it's not the best matchup this week. But we've seen New England be able to take away their top guys. And like I mentioned, he's probably the number 3 target. It's going to be Stephon Diggs and Dawson Knox, who the Patriots are going to focus for, and they'll rely on Gabriel Davis. So even in a bad matchup, I do like Gabriel Davis if you need a wide receiver in a pinch.
And then I have one more wide receiver you could grab if you are in a pinch. Somebody who has done good 3 of the last 4 weeks, and even his dud week, his floor week was not too bad. Russell Gage. He's another person who I feel like I've been trying to get you to add for a while. He is a little bit more rostered, around I think it's 43% right now in NFL.com, but if you're desperate for a wide receiver, he's another great option. He also has a great matchup next week against the Detroit Lions. So you can go out there and I know this sounds ridiculous. If you are absolutely destroyed at wide receiver, if you played Amon-Ra St. Brown and Russell Gage at your 2 wide receiver spots, you actually have a legitimate shot of scoring good points at the wide receiver position next week. Good matchup on both sides. Solid ads off the waiver wire. I mean, obviously, you're not trying to do that if you can help it, but it's amazing how, like, earlier in the season, there was just no good wide receiver options on the wire. And now we're getting down to the end of the fantasy season and the fantasy playoffs, and there's some decent wide receiver options on the wire.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like wide receiver is always, there's some uncharacteristic guys at the end, guys you're not expecting. It's always the ones you look back and like, I can't believe I ever started this guy. But some injuries happen, players get hot, different things go on. Um, Speaking of injuries, though, I do want to talk about one guy that you should be considering adding, especially if you're the Lamar Jackson owner, and that is Tyler Huntley. First off, I got to give a mad shout out to this guy. This guy wasn't invited to the combine. He wasn't drafted, and he came in last week and almost made a heroic comeback against the Cleveland Browns. He got the start this week and almost upset the Green Bay Packers. This guy is putting on a nice little tape here for an audition for another team that, we talked about the quarterback class not being very good heading into next season. Wouldn't be surprised if someone take a flyer on Tyler Huntley. He seems to be the perfect backup behind Lamar Jackson. So if Lamar can't go, we don't know the severity of his ankle. I know Harbaugh is going to try to say, hey, we expect him back. We want him to play. They need to. They are falling that's still a very close division with the Steelers winning and the Bengals winning. That division is so close, and there's a lot of spots up for grab in the AFC. So they need to get back on track. And even though as well as Tyler Huntley played, their best chance to win is still with Lamar Jackson. But Tyler Huntley has played well. He has been a lot more safe with the ball. He hasn't really put the ball on the ground or put the ball in harm's way. He is just running the offense very smoothly. So Tyler Huntley is a guy you could definitely go out there and grab if you have Lamar Jackson, or if you would need a quarterback this week heading into, maybe your quarterback you have is a bad matchup. He might be a guy we would have talked about in our next segment, but since we're talking about him now, we'll probably overlook him. But again, Tyler Huntley, if Lamar Jackson is out, is definitely a guy that could skyrocket into your starting lineup.
And I'm going to just build on this a little bit. So we always talk about handcuffing when it comes to the running back position. I've been doing a little bit of handcuffing at the quarterback position. Like, if there's a league that I have Lamar, I'm going and grabbing Tyler Huntley, dropping my backup quarterback, and I'm going to roll with whoever Baltimore is starting that week. Because Tyler Huntley has proven that with his legs, he can be a solid fantasy quarterback, and Lamar is obviously going to be a solid start if he is going to go. I'm doing the same thing with Jalen Hurts in Philly because you don't know. I mean, Jalen Hurts is expected to play on Tuesday. Obviously, we're recording this before that game. But I went out there and grabbed Gardner Minshew in my leagues that I have Jalen Hurts and said, I'm totally confident rolling with Gardner Minshew in these cakewalk matchups the Eagles have in the last few weeks if Jalen Hurts doesn't go. Dropping my backup quarterback, handcuffing the Philly quarterbacks and going. So, like, handcuffing is not only running backs. If you're running into a situation where the backup quarterback is startable, meaning either he has great matchups and has proven to be a fantasy guy, or if he is a running quarterback, it's just a cheat code. And you don't have to worry about, oh, who do I start? If you don't have to overthink it. You know you have a good play going no matter which way you go, and if anyone's hurt, you're still covered.
That's a great point. Again, now is the time you make roster moves to help you win a championship. Get creative. Think outside the box. That's some of our favorite waivers. As always, be sure to check out the full article on the couchgms.com. But let's get into a little bit of our next segment, which we're going to talk about some streamers for quarterbacks and defenses for Week 16.
So I think we'll start off with the quarterback position in our streamers, and one of my favorite streamers this week has to be Tua. He is facing against the Saints. I know the Saints seem to have a tough defense, but actually their secondary is pretty weak. They're tough against the run, not so much against the pass. And Miami actually has one of the highest pass rates in the NFL. So Tua likes to sling the ball around. He is also probably getting back Jalen Waddle this week. Maybe he'll turn the ball over a couple of times, but I like his chance to score enough points to have you a solid fantasy week if you're in a pinch for a quarterback this week.
Hey, that's definitely a great option. The next guy on our list is Jared Goff. Now, this has an asterisk next to it if he does play, but we talked about it. The Lions are rolling right now. They get the Seattle Seahawks, which could potentially be out of the playoff contention or realistically out of the playoff contention if they drop to the Rams on Tuesday. We won't know until obviously Tuesday night what will happen. But this could be a team that, could be throwing it all in. We'll have to wait and see. But Goff has been playing well. They have some, Amon-Ra St. Brown has been putting up fantasy points. And as Goff continues to sling it, he's the guy that's putting up yardage, which is important for fantasy football.
They're actually playing against the Falcons, which is why the next guy on our list is Matt Ryan. So
well, that would help if I was not looking at the Week 17 schedule. No wonder. I was
Week
like
16 schedule.
I was like, George told me to talk about Jared Goff, and I was like, I mean, the Seattle Seahawks is a pretty decent schedule, but I'll sell it, George. I'll sell it, George.
Yeah, I mean, no.
I'm taking. Don't ignore what I just said about the Seahawks. He's playing the Atlanta Falcons. Boy, is this a great matchup! Yeah, I love this one so much better than the one I just tried to say with the Seattle, which I still think is a decent matchup for Seattle, but compared to the Atlanta Falcons, this is like a home run play.
I mean, on the other side, like, I know Matt Ryan has been a dud sometimes. Like, there's been some weeks where I streamed Matt Ryan in some leagues and he got 2. But Lions versus Falcons might be 35-31. And you might get fantasy scorers everywhere. Like, I hope it's a good Kyle Pitts game for everybody out there. I hope Cordarrelle Patterson bounces back if you got through week 1 with him. I hope that Russell Gage ends up going off on the, off the waiver wire. But, like, Ryan and Goff are 2 solid plays because no matter who gets the points, I think those 2 are going to feast against those defenses this week.
Yeah, I think you wrap that up pretty nicely. So let's pivot over to the defenses. I'm going to talk about Georgia's Eagles defense, not only for streaming for Week 16, but streaming for Week 17 as well. This is a defense that you can literally pick up. You probably should have picked them up last week and start them. I mean, they're playing Washington tomorrow, and then they're going to play the Giants, and then they're going to play Washington again. So this is a defense that you should have picked up and just said, this is my championship winning defense for fantasy football. If for some reason they are still out there, go add them. Then you don't have to worry about defenses for the rest of the fantasy playoffs.
Man, I hope people were on when I added them like what 3 or 4 weeks ago because they had the Giants and then the Jets, and there were a defense I held through the bye week because I knew that I could play them the rest of the regular season. But I know they're still out there in some leagues, so you have to mention it because it's a great matchup. My next defense on the list is the Chargers. I'm gonna make sure that I don't mess up this matchup here
No, it
because
is
I
the
know
Houston
Cody would.
Texans.
It
It's
is
a
the
good pick.
Texans. It's the Texans. Okay. I mean, now Cody has me scared because he was looking at the wrong week. I want to make sure I'm not looking at the wrong week. But the Texans offense has shown signs. The Chargers defense has been decent this year, so I think that they're going to have no problem breaking up maybe a good, game or two out of the Texans. Um, they aren't the flashiest defense. They do get some sacks and takeaways. The only thing that would worry me is if they are in a COVID situation. So I'm still going to throw a little bit of an asterisk on this if they're missing Joey Bosa, if they're missing a couple defensive pieces to COVID. But with these new rules, I'm hopeful that a lot of them will come through before the end of the week, and they are going to be a great fantasy steal.
Absolutely. I agree with that one as well. And again, we're talking streamers for week 16, but don't be afraid to look ahead to week 17 and grab a defense a week early. It's not, again, your bench is not that important at this point in the fantasy playoffs. Like, there is guys that should be on there, and then there's guys that you can move on from to help prepare your team for the future. You don't need as much depth. So those are some of our favorite streaming options. But before we go, we have to do our Thursday night preview.
Thursday night football preview. We got the San Francisco 49ers traveling to the Tennessee Titans. And I think it's because of San Francisco playing on Thursday. It makes it even more interesting with Jeff Wilson, who we talked about earlier in the show as that waiver wire edition, because there's less time for Eli Mitchell to come back from his injury. I hope that actually helps us with if he is out. We know Jeff Wilson's going to be the guy, and he's a great play. Even though the Tennessee defense has been solid, I just know he's somebody who's going to get a workload that could be fantasy relevant.
Yeah, I think that's the big question: is Jeff Wilson going to be the guy if they saved Elijah Mitchell for Thursday, because this is a big matchup. Both teams desperately need a win. The Titans are struggling right now. The 49ers are getting hot as they try to climb their way back into the NFC playoff picture, or potentially even the division, with the stutters of the Rams and Cardinals. So definitely that is something we need to watch out. It's going to be tough as a Jeff Wilson owner and it being a Thursday matchup. It's like, do you hold out hope for a guy like DeAndre Swift against the Atlanta Falcons? Do you throw Jeff Wilson in there and just hope and pray? Like, it's definitely one you have to watch out for. And Elijah Mitchell's return is going to be a big deciding factor of that, whether or not it does happen. Deebo Samuel is definitely in your lineup this upcoming week. The guy has been phenomenal, versatile, all that, and George Kittle. So I think the big question is Jeff Wilson. And I know we just talked about streamers and he wasn't on the list, but Jimmy Garoppolo has actually been a pretty solid, I believe he's been a top 10 fantasy quarterback over the last 5 weeks. So he's putting up decent numbers and is a guy that, isn't being talked about as much. And obviously, the Titans defense has gotten a lot better. They're not the team, even though their fantasy rank is still middle of the path. That's because they were so bad at the beginning of the season. They have conquer or tightened up a little bit. It is a long travel, which is always worrisome on a Thursday night for the 49ers. But I do think Jimmy Garoppolo, if you're desperate, is a guy that you can sneak into your lineup.
I mean, I get it, but I think I like other streamers better than Garoppolo. I like the chances of this being a 13-10 game than I do the 49ers putting up enough points to have Garoppolo have a really good day. Like, I'm hanging my hat on my studs. I'm playing the George Kittle, I'm playing the Deebo Samuel, and I'm playing Jeff Wilson if there's no Elijah Mitchell. If there is Elijah Mitchell, I would probably play him, and that's it. But I don't want to step further out. I would give a shout to the 49ers defense in a play because I think Tennessee's offense is so beat up, and we'll get to the Tennessee side of the ball in a second. But I personally don't love the Garoppolo stream. I would rather go out there and get the Tyler Huntley, get the Tua, get the Goff or Ryan in that matchup rather than the Garoppolo.
Yeah, the only problem with Tyler Huntley is you got to decide on Thursday, and if
Yes.
Lamar does go and you don't have Lamar, well, then you're probably struggling even more. You could end up, playing Justin Fields, which isn't a terrible matchup, but, just something to consider. That's why,
Yes.
again, you don't really need to draft quarterbacks early. You can often find a decent starter on the waiver wire. But let's talk about the Tennessee Titans. Wow. This team has fallen pretty hard the last couple weeks. A couple weeks ago, it looks like they were a lock to win the division. I believe their records are now tied. So the Colts have a tough schedule, but they could still, lose out on the division to the Colts, which would be absolutely heartbreaking after beating them twice this year. But we're going to talk about this matchup on Thursday night. And the good news is A.J. Brown was activated his practice window. I have a hard time believing he is going to be active. His practice window is going to be open, and 4 days later he'll be suiting up. Maybe he will be because they
Agreed.
don't really have a choice. Julio Jones hurt his hamstring again. It is another tough blow. I don't think he'll be good to go on Sunday. So again, no Julio Jones. I'm expecting no A.J. Brown. Not a lot of pass.
I think we have to talk about this. If A.J. Brown gets activated because they're so wide receiver desperate, is it a smokescreen of he's not going to have a full workload? Do you not play him even if he is activated? Or do you take that risk thinking that because there's nobody, he's still going to get the points?
I feel like if A.J. Brown is activated, you have to play him.
Okay.
I mean, this guy did play through a lot of injuries last year. They part of the reason they shut him down is they wanted him healthy for the stretch run. So if he's activated, they feel he's ready to go. And
Okay.
I'm not going to play like a Russell Gage or a Gabriel Davis or an MVS over A.J. Brown. Like the only guy on waivers that I might consider is Amon-Ra St. Brown, just because he's been doing it consistently, and it is such a strong matchup. But it's still going to be tough for me, if healthy, to bench A.J. Maybe he'll be back for your fantasy team. I still have a hard time believing he's going to be back, but my answer would be if he is in the lineup, then he's in your lineup. That's where I stand with him.
Good to know. Going back to the running back position for Tennessee, Dante Foreman is still the guy. You put up another 14.5-point week. He's somebody that it should be a mainstay in your lineup now. And I'm still staying away from Tannehill because of how beat up they are. I would rather start Garoppolo than Tannehill, and you already heard my whole spiel on Garoppolo. So,
yep, I would stay away from Tannehill as well. Between the fumbling issues, I know he did have a rushing touchdown this past week, and running is traditionally an NFL cheat code for when it comes to fantasy quarterbacks. He just doesn't seem like the guy you can trust. And the 49er defense is still good. Nick Bosa is leading the league in pressures over the last 5 or 6 games. So he's a guy that's not being talked about, but could sneakily get back into the comeback player of the year. He's back to being a top 5 defender, especially if Dak Prescott doesn't continue to ball out like he was the first month of the season. So this is going to be a tough match. This is going to be a good matchup, but honestly, I don't think there's a ton of fantasy value like we saw last Thursday when it was the Chiefs Chargers.
agreed. And that's going to be a struggle for a lot of people that are relying on this game. But I don't think there's a ton of people who are relying on Titans outside of maybe Foreman at this point. And 49ers, you still have your stud. You're still probably going to get points out of them. But like I said, I like this chances of this game being a 13-10 a lot more than a big, high-scoring powerhouse game.
Absolutely, George. Well, I think that wraps up our Thursday night preview, wraps up our show for this Tuesday. We'll have another show later in the week. But as always, thank you for listening to this episode of the Couch GMs podcast. Tyler could not be with us again because his work schedules cannot line up for when we want a podcast for you guys. But as always, he wants me to tell you this podcast is more fun for you and more fun for us when you get involved.
Yes, and thank you one more time for listening into the Couch GMs podcast. For Cody Roadcap, I'm George Kerth, and we'll see you all later in the week.